Chapter 7, Diversity in Living Organisms. Diversity means the variations in living organisms. Have you ever thought of the multitude of life forms that surround us? Each organism is different from the other to a lesser or greater extent. For instance, consider yourself and a friend. Are you both of the same height? Does your nose look exactly like your friend's nose? No. Is your hand span the same as your friend's? No. However, if we were to compare ourselves and our friends with a monkey, what would we say? Obviously, we and our friends have a lot in common. When we compare ourselves with a monkey, there are a number of variations. But suppose we were to add a cow to the comparison, it would be completely different. We would then think that the monkey has a lot more in common with us than with the cow. Activity 7.1. We have heard of desi cows and Jersey cows. Does a desi cow look like a Jersey cow? Does all desi cows look alike? Will we be able to identify a Jersey cow in a crowd of desi cows that don't look like each other? What is the basis of our identification? In this activity, we had to decide which characteristics were important in forming the desired category. Hence, we were also deciding which characteristics could be ignored. Now, think of all the different forms in which life occurs on Earth. On the hand, we have microscopic bacteria of a few micrometer in size, while on the other hand, we have a blue whale and redwood trees of California of approximate sizes of 30 meters and 100 meters respectively. Some pine trees live for thousands of years, while insects like mosquitoes die within a few days. Life also ranges from colorless to even transparent worms to brightly colored birds and flowers. This bewildering variety of life around us has evolved on the earth over millions of years. However, we do not have more than a tiny fraction of this time to try and understand all these living organisms. So we cannot look them at one by one. Instead, we look for similarities among the organisms. And in this chapter, we are going to talk about the similarities and dissimilarities. On the basis of that only, they will be divided into kingdoms, species, phylum. So in this chapter, we will come to know more about the diversity in the living organisms, on what basis they are divided, or they vary from us, or we vary from them. Instead, we look for similarities among the organisms, which will allow us to put them into different classes and then study different classes or groups as a whole. In order to make relevant groups to study the variety of life forms, we need to decide which characteristics decide more fundamental differences among organisms, and that one basic is nucleus. This would create the main broad groups of organisms. Within these groups, smaller subgroups will be decided by the less important characteristics. So here we have two in-text questions. Why do we classify organisms? We classify them because there's only a tiny fraction of time to try it and understand all these living organisms. So we cannot look at them one by one. Instead, we look for similarities among the organisms. And on the basis of that, groups are divided, and then the subgroups. And on the basis of that only, we study as a whole. So why do we classify organisms? To understand better and look the organisms as a whole and divide them according to their groups or subgroups, so we can study easily and come to know about them very easily. Yeah. Second one is, give 3 examples of the range of variations that you see in life forms around you. This answer you can write yourself, like we talked about the human beings, monkey, means when you are comparing yourself to a friend and then to a monkey and then to a cow. So you may find some of the similarities between the human beings and the monkey. But cow, that is completely different. And you have to pick some examples from your surrounding, the environment, and that you can use in your answer. So what is the basis of classification? On what base classification is done? Attempts at classifying living things into groups have been made since time immemorial. Greek thinker Aristotle classified animals according to whether they lived on land, in water, or in the air. This is a very simple way of looking at life, but misleading too. For example, animals that live in the sea include corals, whales, octopuses, starfish, and sharks. We can immediately see that these are different from each other in numerous ways, but these all are aquatic. In fact, habitat, the surroundings in which we live, habitat is the only point they share in common, that is the water. This is not an appropriate way of making groups of organisms to study and think about. We therefore need to decide which characteristics to be used as the basis for making the broadest divisions. Then we will have to pick the next set of characteristics for making subgroups within these divisions. This process of classification within each group can then continue using new characteristics each time. Before we go on, we need to think about what is meant by characteristics. In simple word, you can keep in mind the properties, the features. When we are trying to classify a diverse group of organisms, we need to find ways in which some of them are similar enough to be thought of together. These ways, in fact, are details of appearance or behavior. In other words, form and function. What we mean by characteristic is a particular feature or a particular function. That most of us have 5 fingers on each hand is thus a characteristic. That we can run but the banyan tree cannot is also a characteristic. Now, to understand how some characteristics are decided as being more fundamental than others, let us consider how a stone wall is built. The stones used will have different shapes and sizes. The stones at the top of the wall would not influence the choice of stones that come below them. On the other hand, the shapes and sizes of stones in the lowermost layer will decide the shape and size of the next layer, and so on, like the designs are made on the wall. And after the plaster has been done, we cannot see the bricks which are inside that, and they give a shape to a room. The stones in the lowermost layer are like the characteristics that decide the broadest divisions among living organisms, and these are called cell. They are independent of any other characteristics in their effects on the form and function of the organism. The characteristics in the next level would be dependent on the previous one, which are inherited from the mother cell to the daughter cell. The characteristics in the next level would be dependent on the previous one and would decide the variety in the next level. In this, we can build a whole hierarchy of mutually related characteristics to be used for classification. Mutually related means which are similar. Like we took an example, the fingers. 5 fingers are present on the hand, and this is common in the human beings or the animals also. We see some that come in the category of mammals. Nowadays, we look at many interrelated characteristics starting from the nature of the cell in order to classify all living organisms. What are the some concrete examples, strong examples, of such characteristics used for hierarchical classification? A eukaryotic cell has membrane-bound organelles. That is, nuclear membrane is present around the nucleus. It has the well-defined nuclear region, so-called nuclei. But in prokaryotic, it is absent, which allows cellular processes to be carried out efficiently in isolation from each other. Isolation means a single cell performs all the activities that are needed for a living organism, like digestion, excretion, assimilation. These all processes are performed by a one single particular cell. That is the meaning of isolation. Therefore, organisms which do not have a clearly demarcated nucleus, that is the well-defined nuclear region, or you can say nuclear membrane is not present around the nucleus. And the other organelles would need to have their biochemical pathways organized in very different ways. This would have an effect on every aspect of cell design. Further, nucleated cells would have the capacity to participate in making a multicellular organism, as cells join to form tissues. Means when the cell division is done, they are getting multiplied. 1 into 2, then 4, then 8, 16, 32, and like this the process goes on. Further, nucleated cells would have the capacity to participate in making multicellular organism because they can take up the specialized functions. Therefore, nucleus can be basic characteristic of the classification. You can underline this line. This is one of the important. Nucleus can be the basic characteristic of a classification because the cells are divided on the basis of nucleus only. That is the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells. So this was one of the characteristics which we talked about, the eukaryotic cell and the prokaryotic cell. And there are 4 more characteristics which we will talk over, and then after that we will go through the chapter. And in our next class we will talk about the remaining characteristics. On the basis of that, division of organisms is done. And the basic thing that we have to note is the characteristic, that is the nucleus. The first characteristic we talked about. And the second one and the next 4 we will talk about in our next class. Thank you. Take care.